In reality, the Fed is a much quieter, I would even say genteel institution controlled by a silent majority of academics who've largely been trained in the same exact school of thought. The Fed's leaders get along in the most civil way imaginable, and therein lies the problem. Because the Fed is anything but powerless. In fact, it is very powerful. I've come to refer to this cabal of unelected, as Nomi explained, unelected officials as the fourth branch of the United States government. The problem is what's missing, and that's the checks and balances that our forefathers put in place to prevent any one arm of the US government from attaining too much power over we, the people. One of the reasons I ended up as fed up as I am is that the overly intrusive actions of those who've shepherded our financial system since Greenspan took office on August the 11th, 1987, have taken a grave toll on our nation's economic well-being. And after listening to Nomi, I'm convinced that they've taken a grave toll also in our position as a sovereign nation in this world. How so? Put your seatbelts on. This is going to be like the only fun part of my comments. I'm just saying. In a normal state, markets function as price discovery mechanisms. I'm going to share a story with you to explain. Ask any woman anywhere around the world, this is universal, and she will tell you that there's nothing as delightful as being on the receiving end of a perfect robin's egg blue gift box, the iconic representation of Tiffany's jeweler. As it so happens, a story about Charles Louis Tiffany and J.P. Morgan, the banker, has proved immensely valuable in explaining how financial markets are intended to act to my four children. Being the astute jeweler that he was, Mr. Tiffany knew that Mr. Morgan had an acute affinity for diamond stick pins. One day, Tiffany came across a particularly unusual and extraordinarily beautiful stick pin. As was the custom of the day, he sent a man around to Morgan's office with the stick pin, elegantly wrapped in a robin's egg blue gift box, with the following note enclosed. My dear Mr. Morgan, knowing your exceptional taste in stick pins, I have sent this rare and exquisite piece for your consideration. Due to its rarity, it is priced at $5,000. If you choose to accept it, please send a man to my offices tomorrow with your check for $5,000. If you choose not to accept, you may send your man back with the pin. So the next day, the man arrived at Tiffany's with the same box in a new wrapping and a different message. In that envelope was a note which read, My dear Mr. Tiffany, the pin is truly magnificent. The price of $5,000 may be a bit rich. I've enclosed a check for $4,000. If you choose to accept, send my man back with the box. If not, send back the check. He will leave the box with you. Okay? Tiffany stared at the check for several minutes. It was indeed a great deal of money, and yet he was sure the pin was worth every penny of $5,000. Finally, he said to the man, you may return the check to Mr. Morgan. My price was firm. And so the man took the check and placed the gift wrap box on Tiffany's desk. Tiffany sat for a minute thinking of the check he'd returned, and then he unwrapped the box to remove the stick pin. When he opened the box, he found not the stick pin, but rather a check from Morgan for $5,000 and a note with a single sentence. Just checking the price. Just checking the price. That, my friends, that is how markets are meant to operate in a natural state. Today, though, we trade in the dark. We have done so since 1987. That year may stick in your minds for two very good reasons. A, the stock market crashed, but B, and much more importantly, there was a new sheriff in town. Alan Greenspan had just been named chairman of the Fed. Eventually, he would be referred to simply as the maestro for his ability to suspend the business cycle, and more importantly, the magical way he created mountains of wealth, a skill he passed down to his two successors. How did it all begin? Well, in fact, there's another story. And yes, it does begin on a fateful day in 1987, though it was not the 19th, as you may be thinking. On that Monday, Alan Greenspan was aboard a plane on a flight from Washington, D.C. into DFW, as it so happens. He was to deliver a keynote address at a prestigious economics conference that next morning. When he landed, a really frazzled Dallas Federal Reserve employee rushed the plane with one of those old-fashioned brick phones. There was somebody on the other end of the line from the Federal Reserve Board in D.C. informing him that the Dow Jones Industrials had crashed when he was in the air. It had fallen 508 points, 23% in one trading session, which remains to this day the worst in U.S. stock market history. Suffice it to say, Greenspan never made it to the podium. First thing the next morning, he was aboard another plane back to Washington, D.C. to do damage control, something he got to be very good at. He directed the Fed to release a statement that said the following: "The Federal Reserve, consistent with its responsibilities as the nation's central bank, affirmed today its readiness to serve as a source of liquidity to support the economic and financial systems." He was not kidding. In the weeks and months that followed, Greenspan would go so far as to allow those on the New York Fed's open market desk to leak information to Wall Street bond trading desks ahead of Fed moves to inject liquidity into the system. This is documented. In Wall Street parlance, he had invited those who would profit the most to front-run the Fed. As the years went by, Greenspan would increasingly impose his will upon financial markets. 1994's double whammy of Mexico's tequila crisis, as Nomi just described, Orange County, California's bankruptcy, both were met with emergency measures. This was followed in 1998 with the implosion of Long-Term Capital Management, an academic-run hedge fund that threatened to unleash systemic risk across the global financial system. All of these effective rescues led to the sustainability of the most overvalued stock market in U.S. history, one that collapsed under its own weight, as we all remember, in March of 2000. Now, as a rookie on Wall Street in 1996, the same year Greenspan called out investors' irrational exuberance, I can tell you I didn't know what the Fed was, but that the Fed's actions gave new meaning to the idea of the invisible hand, unleashing untold levels of moral hazard as investors became increasingly brazen speculators, knowing their risk of loss would be mitigated if something went wrong. Before there was "Don't Fight the Fed," the establishment of "the Fed has your back" came first. I'll never forget raising my hand at a meeting at DLJ in the morning, asking our in-house equity analyst why he refused to lower his price target on a company by the name of Enron, despite this big energy firm's clear lack of ability to generate something we call a profit. Now, the simple answer is that this analyst, who made his mother proud years later testifying in front of Congress, he knew what I knew. What I did not know, and that's that his back was covered as long as the music was playing, as Chuck Prince famously said. That is, of course, until Enron blew up. And he was right. Wall Street made boatloads off speculative deals all the way up until the day bankruptcy declared, and this is just one example. The bottom line is Wall Street knew it would always win, even if it required taking Main Street down. They've never blinked an eye in that process. All the while, price discovery got slowly ravaged. Today, we all wear beer goggles. I can promise you I had to do a full translation of beer goggles to the people in Brussels. Y'all know what beer goggles are. And you know that come closing time, they make everything appear a lot more attractive than what they really are. Just saying. I wrote about it this last week. It'd been a long time since I read those Mickey Gilley, I thought I was going home with an 8 and woke up with a 1. Anyways, we won't go there because it's not PC. Okay. All you need to know about those beer goggles is the day that it started. And that was not the 19th of October, 1987, but rather the 20th of October, 1987, the day of the birth of the Greenspan put. In the roller coaster years that followed, Greenspan would again pull out all stops to prevent creative destruction from taking hold. The Fed's extraordinary exertions, of course, led to the inflation of the housing bubble, which eventually culminated in the great financial crisis and the Fed's subsequent reaction that we now know has gone global and viral. The reaction, of course, refers to the zero interest rate policy and quantitative easing years, a time that defines the time that I was on the inside at the Fed. The $24 trillion in wealth created during the housing boom and largely destroyed by the subsequent crisis has today been largely displaced by the $40 trillion in paper gains that have been generated since the stock market bottomed in March 2009. Now, you may note, we've got fire alerts going on all around here. You may note that I use the word paper to describe investors' gains, and that's intentional. Paper, as you know, is highly combustible. So what do those two eras, separated by a decade, have in common? Well, in a word, valuations. No matter how you measure valuations today, asset prices have run wild. As was the case in the years preceding the last crisis, asset price inflation is curiously absent from most of the gauges that the Fed uses to track inflation. There's a new one that actually does capture asset price inflation. We could spend 2 hours talking about it, mainly because it now gives the Fed license to stay lower for longer in the next crisis. They are now going to try and set inflation within a target range that can run above the 2% target that they've never managed to hit. In any event, I digress. The good news is most people at the Fed still don't know how to measure inflation, which makes it mighty hard for them to know that commercial real estate in this country has never, ever been as richly valued as it is today. Valuations have long since pierced their former highs. I speak privately to people in commercial real estate, and they tell me every other day that they've never seen anything like this in their career. A lot of it has to do with the money chasing after the asset class. It's never even been involved in it.